To start recording, and here, of course, we left off last week looking at perestroika. This is Gorbachev and Castro making a public display of unity in the face of uh, their country's relationship completely dismantling. And I think, this class isn't dedicated to the Soviet Union, but I think it's important to remember that that Soviet history is very important because Cuba became dependent on the Soviet Union, over dependent, trading sugar for oil, for example, selling sugar at lower than market rates, and becoming very dependent on the Soviet Union. So when the Soviet Union collapsed, due to, I think, just its own, we don't want to need to debate whether or not communism or capitalism, because who knows in the end which one will be, the most viable. But clearly there's some kind of internal disruption in the Soviet Union, either because it became too imperialistic and too expanded too far, or maybe just the economic situation, whatever may have been the case, or the Cold War, spending too much money on weapons. But the Soviet Union collapses and shrinks to its kind of Russia, which is the country that expanded to become the Soviet Union by absorbing the Eastern Bloc countries, Ukraine, and other places. So today, Russia is kind of shrinking back to its kind of national territorial integrity, and that began with Gorbachev and this kind of restructuring of the politics, but then, of course, also the cultural openness called glasnost. And Cuba really resisted this, and to the point where, if you read the quote down below, people in Cuba weren't really even aware, because I think there was a blackout, a kind of media silencing in Cuba, because they didn't want the same thing to happen in Cuba. I think there was a sense that if Cuba allows these changes to take place, then they're just going to quickly become the 51st country of the United States, and the revolution will completely be a failure and go down in flames. And I think Fidel Castro, being in the sort of twilight of his career, was really concerned about his legacy and really wanted to make sure that Cuba didn't that the revolution wasn't just erased from memory. And that that is not that's not beyond the scope of imagination. I think you have to remember Fidel Castro had a very personal investment in the revolution, having fought in the Sierra Maestra, having gone to jail, and you can understand why someone, a leader, might have a hard time letting go of power, especially if they feel like, maybe they go to jail or they get arrested or may face consequences. So, human beings are fallible. And, in this case, Cuba has a heightened sense of nationalism. And of course, the United States being an adversarial country, you can understand how that only kind of you have to recalibrate your understanding of kind of right and wrong, and what Castro's obligations is to his country, to his own career, his own legacy. He famously said in his writings from prison that history will absolve him. Basically, that's kind of the ends justify the means kind of doctrine. And maybe that's, I guess it depends on the historian and depends on when. But just the idea of saying history will absolve me is, for me, is definitely kind of veers into a kind of sociopathy, because you're kind of saying, well, even if the Cuban people have suffered, or you could say, even if the Cuban people suffer, it doesn't matter, because in the end, their suffering will be worth it, because history will look back and say that Fidel Castro had a vision beyond the sort of suffering of the people. But a lot of other people might say, well, the whole measurement of absolution, of you being absolved, is whether or not you let people suffered on your march to historical absolution, right? So to focus on history rather than just the needs of the individual Cuban, is a little Machiavellian, or is a little kind of I think lacking in compassion. And I think it goes to just the idea of politicians being somewhat out of touch with the needs. It's very hard to find politicians who are, I think, grounded, and or not don't become corrupt by power, and or by being so alienated from the electorate. That happens in every country. And sometimes term limits help, sometimes having a good civic society that educates well, so that you have good leaders emerging from the fabric of the country. That's something important. But Fidel Castro is the only person in power for, like, what, several decades. And it's very similar to what happened in Mexico that led to the Mexican Revolution, where you had this guy Porfirio Diaz in power for 30 years in Mexico. And then after he died or left power, went into exile, there was a power vacuum. And in a lot of ways, you have a power vacuum today after Fidel Castro's death in 2016, but it's almost like the vacuum hasn't been allowed to fully kind of reveal itself, perhaps due to the pandemic or other things. But I do think there is very much a parallel to Mexico. I don't know if there'll be a revolution in Mexico. It could be that revolutions are now somewhat irrelevant, um, but there might be a humanitarian crisis, and or a lot of Cuba might really become a very important political subject in the coming years, because there's a kind of spiraling, like who's in charge, what's the future of Cuba. And I really think it's you have to kind of consider this era. We're in the post-Fidel era of revolutionary Cuba. And it's really hard to imagine the Cuban Revolution without Fidel Castro. It's kind of like having, in South Africa, maybe after Nelson Mandela's death. Ironically or incidentally, Fidel Castro was very close to Nelson Mandela because remember what we learned about the Cubans helping the Angola fight against the imperialist designs of South Africa. So, I think internationally, Fidel Castro is celebrated in Africa. I think Southern Africa is celebrated, but I think the average Cuban person is probably a better measurement of Fidel Castro's quality as a leader. I think I wouldn't expect, I would assume that someone in the United States would be the best person to evaluate a leader in the United States versus, say, someone from another country. Not that their input wouldn't be meaningful, but I think when it comes to judging Fidel, it's probably best to judge him from the point of view of Cuba, right? Not history, for instance. So a lot of changes taking place in Cuba in the 1990s, which are very, very much, I think, potentially could lead to Cuba unraveling completely. So we saw performance became a very important refuge for artists in the 1980s and especially into the 1990s. And we saw that the experience of Antoniaitis was sort of a warning to a lot of other artists, maybe what to avoid, or maybe even to avoid painting or subject matter that is unflattering towards Cubans. The country does sort of atone for its, I think, errors with Antoniaitis by giving him this very prestigious award in the late 80s, but you really have to see that as part of the government trying to course correct, anticipating a lot of changes, and anticipating that, and perhaps realizing that the arts are one of the remaining places where the Cuban government can celebrate the revolution, especially as other industries start to evaporate, like even sugar, or lacking oil, or the overall just collapse of all these different institutions. But the arts is one institution that continues to maybe be a fitting cultural ambassador for the revolution. So that's really, I think, important for us to remember, that artists become almost this elite group of society in Cuba that's able to, we'll see in the 21st century especially, travel freely back and forth to benefit from travel to Europe, United States, Asia, other countries, other continents. And that, I think, increasingly alienates them from the average Cuban who doesn't benefit from the ability to freely travel. So, these changes in Europe are kind of a ripple, a domino effect that leads all the way to, I think, the collapse of, I think, well, just generally just the end of the Cold War, right? The end of this kind of polarized world between capitalism or communism. And, what is your political relevance in the aftermath of the Cold War? And I think that's really important, because a lot of Cuba's relevance was based on the heightened political animosity between the Soviet Union and the United States. So, Cuba lost the Soviet Union, and it loses all the things that the Soviet Union brought to Cuba, which we talked a little bit about last week. So we need not spend too much time on it, but you can really kind of appreciate how, at ground level, the average Cuban is really going to start questioning whether or not, the revolution it will continue much further, whether or not, all the benefits from the revolution, maybe healthcare, um, um, yeah, maybe guaranteed work, things that you might expect in a communist country. That food consumption decreases. A lot of ministries are closed. So I think there's a real sense of uncertainty starting in the 90s, and not just uncertainty, but starting with uncertainty, and then that declines into like no food, no unreliable electricity, and I think a real sense of being isolated from the rest of the world, because you can't travel, and perhaps because there's a media blackout about a lot of the changes going on. And especially when you have that blackout while bringing tourists to your country, you might hear things that reveal there's much more going on in the world than the country is willing to share with you. So it's a kind of double-edged sword with tourism. You get all the benefits of tourism, but it might also mean, Cubans are exposed to things going on in other countries that the government doesn't want them to know about. Things like changes going on in the Soviet Union. All the cattle die in Cuba because they don't have food to eat. Um, and really just a real, I think, if you're an older person in Cuba, you've really kind of seen Cuba go from, you know, standing up to the United States, relative prosperity, to, a total nightmare by the 1990s. And, whether or not you necessarily, the average Cuban blame Fidel Castro or the United States kind of becomes irrelevant at this point. You don't really care, because all that matters is whether or not you can, get your next meal the following day, or feel like you can feed your family, or go to work and have enough oil in your car. So you could see how, your obligation to politics becomes really completely evaporates in the face of lack of basic needs. And so the Cuban government will invest heavily in tourism, as a way to lift Cuba up economically. Um, but the average Cuban, doesn't necessarily benefit immediately from tourism. And, they, I think, reach a point where it's like, look, there's no future here. There's no food, there's no prospects for work. And so people get into these really horrible makeshift boats to cross the Straits of Florida, and this is known as the Balsero crisis. And I think we covered some of this, so I don't want to repeat it, but just this idea of the government going through decades of not really investing in anything. In this case, he's talking about how sports became this kind of symbolic way of celebrating the revolution. But it's one thing to, have great athletes, but another thing to have, a great, so reliable system of agriculture, investing in food rather than sugar, for instance. So I think this athlete points out a kind of parallel between the arts and sports, where in a way, in the 90s, arts becomes the equivalent of a kind of form of propaganda, but that propaganda flies in the face of the reality of the fact that the government hasn't really diversified the economy to the point where it can handle a crisis like this. So a lot of athletes leave Cuba, a lot of artists will leave Cuba, and a lot of Cubans just generally will leave Cuba. And so what about artists? I think we saw Angel Delgado defecated on top of the Granma newspaper as an act of defiance, and or maybe just a way of saying, look, there's no toilet paper. I'm going to use the newspaper, which is, I think really wonderful, and wonderfully symbolic. But of course, something that's really pushes buttons and will land him in jail. And we saw this last week. I'm just kind of summarizing so we can pick up where we left off and have some context. And he becomes, I think, a real hero to the Cuban art scene, to the point where I think, obviously, using, defecation as a symbol for, like a personal experience that's like hidden away from view, making light of using that defecation as a kind of way of, making parody or satire. Um, and I think this is something we see in, art world all around the world. Grotesquerie and focusing on the profane, especially in a world where the revolution is sacred. You think about it, go to church or a temple or a synagogue. Usually, you don't hear jokes, or a place like that is all about reverence and sacredness. And the revolution is reverent or sacred, and you must have reverence for the revolution. So just the idea of making art about, defecation or satire or comedy is a way of kind of balancing out that reverence with some profanity, with some kind of sort of like, Duchamp at his, ready-made art was kind of a counterbalance to the rise of fascism or the, World War One, and some kind of reverence for governments or technology led to so many horrible things like gas, mustard gas, and people dying in World War One, and wholesale slaughter of people because people thought machinery would solve all the problems, technology would solve all of our problems. Well, the art world often responds with comedy and satire in the face of kind of reckless reverence, right? So Charlie Chaplin is like the counterbalance to Hitler. And so I think in the art world in the 90s in Cuba, these artists become a kind of counterbalance to that reverence, which, up until the 90s, maybe that reverence for the Cuban government was justified. But after, I think, the special period during this time, that reverence almost seems kind of like a form of humiliation. It's almost humiliating to show reverence in a time when you can't even find your next meal. So I think what's going on here, someone here in the picture, you see these shapes. This is defecation. I guess I'm trying to think of a good word that's not too too slang here. But the different pictures, the shape of the island, and eating it. I think it's kind of a comment on the lack of food. But also I think just making irreverence a key part of their art is something that really goes against, I think you could expect to go against the grain in a society where the personal is political, where the revolution is supposed to, everything fits into the revolution. So here you can almost see the revolution losing some of its absolute control over every aspect of life. And the choteo, as you might see in your reading, hopefully you're following along your reading, becomes a really important part of this kind of era, and making jokes, kind of that joking is kind of what choteo is. And maybe you could see this as a form of joking, but I don't think the Cuban government found it very funny. They put him in jail for what, 6 months, and becomes kind of I think somewhat of a hero in the art world. And I think he'll continue that legacy will continue to, I think, carry on into the future as people look back at the special period and say, oh, hey, what did we do during this period? And they'll look at Angel Delgado and really probably, celebrate him. But it's, I think, an interesting question. I don't know personally if Delgado is still in Cuba. I'll find out and let you know next class. But you can understand how that, if he did in fact go to Miami, that does kind of add another part of the story that somewhat kind of removes him from that story, right? But it depends on whether he goes back to Cuba, and we see this throughout Cuban history. Fidel Castro does something to stand up to the government, goes to prison, goes into exile, and then will he come back? And I think you have to come back. In order to have a comeback, you have to go away, right? But in order to kind of maintain that relevance, you have to come back to Cuba. And so I think what we'll probably see in the next decade or so is the next story about Cuba will be artists in Cuba who went into exile for whatever reason will figure out a way back to Cuba. And it's a question of what will tantalize Cubans enough to want to even go back to Cuba. And I think that will be a question we'll just keep asking as we move forward. So these will probably become all the more iconic as time marches on. The idea of going to prison for your art is really, powerful. And of course, it's a mirror image of Fidel Castro going to prison for his own political beliefs. And, a certain irony of throwing artists in jail, especially when it really seems to resemble what Fidel Castro went through. And now remember, during this time in the 1990s, paper is very scarce, painting supplies are very scarce. So a lot of these artists will kind of have to really become very resourceful and inventive when it comes to making art, especially as they realize, the government, these institutions, the patronage is all drying up. And you can't really do performance anymore because maybe you might, maybe Angel Delgado made performance all the more radioactive as a, outlet for your self-expression. So I think it really becomes a matter of, what are how far can you express yourself and what can you say about these changes, especially when the government wants you to kind of pretend that there's nothing going on. I mean, just the word special period is a euphemism, is a kind of nice way of talking about something much that's much worse than it actually sounds, right? So that idea of a euphemism, a metaphorical sort of language is really, I think, what this picture is all about. There's sort of three different voices. There's your public voice, your private voice, um, and then maybe even, and then there's this sort of maybe other voice of your conscience or something. So there's kind of a dialogue and I think a conflict within that dialogue between what you're supposed to say publicly, what you're thinking, and then maybe what your heart obligates you to do. And it might be, well, I am obligated to my family, but I'm thinking about going to the United States, but publicly I'm showing support for the government. So we might think about how each of these artists kind of relates to this kind of different facets of what's going on in society. And I think Belkis Ayon is a very interesting artist. I hope some of you are interested in writing about her work. I get the impression that in this time, she's kind of like we've seen other artists, they're kind of retreating into this Afro-Cuban culture and trying to revive it using their artwork. In the same way Wilfredo Lam tried to restore dignity to Afro-Cuban religion and the tradition. I think, especially we think about how the Cuban government was not supportive of any religion whatsoever, the idea of illustrating these rites within Afro-Cuban religion is very powerful and a really wonderful way of maybe going back to this idea of restoring your culture, especially maybe as the revolution loses its grip on every facet of society. Religion starts rising as a outlet for people's frustrations, and we'll see the Pope visits Cuba in the 1990s, and the Cuban government just generally loses its grip on some of the things it had total control over before, either because of economic decline or just the lack of political will. And we see that in the art world, and I think we also see that in religion. So as the Cuban government loses some of its absolute authority, religion and art bubble up as outlets for personal, sense of personal, what would you say, kind of personal, spiritual expression, or just feeling like you have some kind of connection to some higher power or connection to your cultural roots. And all this is kind of maybe in defiance of politics and or at the expense of politics or just apart from politics. So, for me, as I say this, I realize you could say this is art that's outside the revolution, right? So just on that, it's a, powerful way of saying, look, I'm asserting my own artistic autonomy and I'm making pictures that address Afro-Cuban religion, and there's nothing political about it. Um, and that's beautiful. And I think that's really why I keep kind of harping on the same idea because, there's yes, there's places where maybe it's important to be within the revolution, but I think it's so important to have places where there's like a affirmation of some kind of deep well of humanity that's so much deeper and higher than anything political, right? And it might just mean your own connection to the cosmos, right? Maybe your connection to your family, maybe your connection to your own desires, like your sexuality or your, personal preferences, what you eat, what you think about. And so I think it's important for there always to be a place that is your own personal domain, that's free from anyone's sort of scrutiny or supervision. And I think that's partly what's going on here. But I think also you have to look at this within the realm of Afro-Cuban religion. There's also a very male-dominated aspect to the religion, and I think she's also trying to kind of reframe Afro-Cuban religion from the point of view of a woman, and I think that's something for you guys to explore if you're interested in her work. Because they're almost a shade of, maybe using this black and white color palette, but I think that has more to do with the lack of materials and art materials. Reducing your work to a black and white is something we saw Rodchenko do in the Soviet Union, but here I think she's doing it more as a way to, illustrate these rites in Afro-Cuban religion that are otherwise invisible because they're not, it's not like they're meant to be painted, right? They're just performances or rituals that take place under the safety of night, far removed from politics. And so I think her illustrating these, bringing them to life with art, is something for you to think about if you want to write about her work. But for me, it's really all about kind of having a sort of realm that's beyond the revolution. And I think when you look at this, you just have to say, well, it's certainly worthy to have works like these, and it would be a real loss for everyone um, to not see works like these because they don't fit into a revolutionary framework. So you can see here, this is some of the the legends brought to life. So bringing, kind of affirming Afro-Cuban religion by illustrating and kind of the same way Christian painters affirm Christianity by bringing the Bible to life. Well, in this case, a lot of these religious practices were hidden, if not, totally, done, without anyone knowing about it, because that was the whole point. Religions were outlawed under the revolution. So this, you could see this as just the revolution losing some of its absolute power, and a sign that that religion is now growing in its relevance in a time of crisis. And, I think that's important to think about. There clearly was something going on with Belkis Ayan in crisis, because sadly she will go on to commit suicide during this period. And I don't know too much about that. It's very hard to get details about Cuba, because a lot of people might be very, closed-mouthed about things because they don't want to get in trouble. And so I'm still kind of researching and finding out about the reasons why she committed suicide, but there's not know too much about it. But I think when you look at this work, there does seem to be some kind of soul searching going on, and you might wonder how her own personal kind of demise relates to the greater context of what's going on. 'Cause it's a real tragic end to her career. But I think she does kind of honor this legacy of Wilfredo Lamb, and it's almost like a continuity from his work that we saw earlier, with, of course, her own twist. So yeah, she's a wonderful artist to write about from the 1990s. And other artists from this time, I think, likewise are kind of, what is your strategy in response to things going on in the country? Maybe lack of resources for making art, maybe performance art has become too radioactive because of what Angel Delgado did, and people probably still remember the legacy or what happened to Antonia Itis. Now, perhaps that's changed because the government is awarding her things, so maybe people will get a sense that, okay, there's a little bit more room to, maybe make art that's political and or oversteps the government's monopoly on imagery. So you might think about, other strategies like maybe using metaphor. So I think that's really important to think about when you look at this art today is, what is the strategy in the face of, political crisis, economic crisis, social crisis, and, how much does this work reflect this sense of anxiety going on in Cuba, especially this idea of should I stay or should I go? And that really the common theme of a lot of the work we see today is crossing the water, leaving your world, going to another world. And even here, I think, flamingo trapped in a net between a black world and a kind of blue world almost implies like kind of travel, crossing a border, leaving behind one place, but it obviously still trapped in this net. So I think that's kind of being trapped in a net is probably a very powerful sort of metaphor for the political situation in Cuba. And so the water, yeah, we saw water last week. You could just say it's a waterfall, but you could also say it's a metaphor for being outside the revolution, right? For that inner world, which is all water, is, literally, separated from politics. And so you could see water as a kind of powerful metaphor for describing that sort of spiritual journey and for asserting a sense of being outside the revolution. And of course, the figure contemplating another figure across the water, you can't help but think about that as being a metaphor for Florida, the Straits of Florida, that watery divide that separates Cuba from the rest of the world or connects it to the rest of the world, right? Columbus took the water to arrive to Cuba. So I think the water is both a road, but also a wall, right? So here we are at the Malecon, which is the real like spot to hang out if you ever go to Havana. This is the seawall. Ironically, I think it was built by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers early last century, and remains the sort of hangout spot for Cubans in Havana. And yeah, if any night, especially the weekend, you'll see just thousands of people lined up on the seawall as a place to hang out. But in a way, it's sort of a metaphorical barrier. It's as far as you can get to the United States without, plunging into the water. Um, and so it's kind of like a barrier. And it's kind of like a lookout point. a place where you go to hang out with other people. And of course, is also a launching pad for a lot of people's journey across the Straits of Florida to arrive in the United States. And we can see the artists from this period really, I think, shift their focus directly and focus exclusively on this idea of, because in the background in everyone's mind is, should I stay or should I go? Should I go to Florida and risk, getting eaten alive by sharks, which sadly happens to, probably, if not dozens, probably more Cubans, because who knows, there probably isn't good census data about the numbers of people, but probably thousands of people cross the Straits of Florida. In the background, you can see the map there of Florida. And just, I think the idea is the artist here is contemplating going to Cuba and thinking about, what that means, and or making art that relates to this question that's on the back of everyone's mind. Excuse me. So boats, water, everyone I'm sure has made a boat out of paper. And I think the comment here is, people in Cuba are getting into the equivalent of boats made out of paper, making boats out of whatever they can. This seems almost like uh, maybe it could be commenting on the connection between slaves being forcibly loaded into boats, anonymous, how many thousands of slaves just perished in the water when the ships, shipwrecks and other being thrown overboard because of Spanish cruelty or indifference. And I think there's an interest, they're making a parallel between the idea of maybe getting lost at sea anonymously, to these Cubans, likewise, who are getting lost at sea. And so, connection back to slavery and maybe the, indifference of society towards people who are just sort of, subject to the political realities, economic realities of the world. And, I think, you can interpret that different ways here, whether or not relates to necessarily what's going on with the Balsetto crisis is maybe open for debate, but I do think the hand is like a symbol of an individuality, right? But having them kind of lined up, almost like an inventory, is something somewhat dehumanizing. So that could be, something worth, Ernesto Pujol obviously plays with metaphor very powerfully. I think we saw his work over here too. No, that's different. But yeah, metaphor, very powerful. Um, and here, sharks, we see sharks, this kind of becomes his motif. Flying is, crossing, having no boundaries, having no political boundaries. And Cho, his work has been widely distributed around the world, and I think contributes to this overall. I think Cubans were sort of not the origin of this focus on migration, but certainly one of the main epicenters of this kind of focus on migration, which has become, I think, now almost like, I don't want to say cliche, because of course, it can't be cliche because we're talking about real human suffering and real human experiences. But I think in the art world, it's almost become like expected to see like migration as a key subject matter today, because it's so kind of widespread and universal and so much part of this idea of globalization, right? And you really have to think of globalization and as a pendulum shifting between nationalism and globalization, and what are the boundaries of political globalization versus, having some sense of governments that are accountable to you at a local level. In the 90s, we said think globally, act locally. And today, it's, I think, a real question, the age of the internet, social media. I think a lot of people are losing their sense of a connection to your nation in favor of a connection to, everyone in the world. But of course, that doesn't mean that there aren't nations, and maybe shifting back to nationalism will be a response to the realization that political globalization maybe isn't as cracked up as people might want it to be. I mean, there's a certain value to economic globalization. Cultural globalization is inevitable, but I can't believe a world where we have one president running the whole world would be better than having, presidents in each nation, and each nation should decide their own political destiny rather than some one world government. So I think migration is sort of like part of globalization, part of people realizing that, this interconnectedness of the world economies, and certainly I think the other side of migration is exploitation of labor, exploitation of people who are seeking a better life. And, I think that's really so important for understanding the United States that we are kind of founded on this idea of taking advantage of cheap labor. Um, and of course, migration very much relates to that because migrants are the most easily exploited people in the world, right? So, these I think are both boats, but they're also meant to be metaphors for people, right? Taking that journey across the Straits of Florida. And I think the idea is, look, these are like a fleet. It's not just a boat, it's like an invasion, an armada of boats, but they're not a military boat. It's like it's people fleeing, running away from a political situation. And I think the idea is every boat that Cubans make is really a makeshift sort of boat and maybe captures all the individuality of each experience. But just the idea of, this as art, it's not, well, what would you say? How would you describe this? How would you describe this kind of art to someone? What's the genre or the sort of, and, is this, yeah, what would you say is this? What kind of art is this? Not painting? Is it sculpture? Anyone got an idea for how you'd characterize this kind of art? So you might call it like maybe site specific or installation, right? So, and I think this is important for understanding that there's not a lot of resources in Cuba. So this artist isn't doing this necessarily on paper, but because there's no paper, it almost makes it more effective because they're really being resourceful and inventive about how to address this topic, but doing so in a way that bypasses traditional means, right? And I think because of that, that's sort of the genius of the Cuban artists. They're very capable of finding a solution to the problem of, how do I address this thing that's so meaningful and important because either they're thinking about leaving, or they've had family members who've left who are now in another country, and or maybe they know people who died and maybe never heard from them again. And here you can see people watching, kind of witnessing people as they disembark from Cuba to Florida. And I assume all three of those men are going to get on that boat. And I don't know if you about you guys, but that is a really horrible way of going 90 miles. And you can just imagine how unlikely it is that a lot of these boats will even survive, 10 miles. You're going against the currents. There's weather conditions, there's sharks, and the United States kind of incentivizes Cubans to do this by offering citizenship once you arrive in Florida, which, maybe sounds really good, but also, incentivizes people to put their lives in jeopardy. And I mean, just look at how many people are on this boat. It's one thing to go from Mexico or Central America to United States. And often, and I know this from living in Guatemala, if you want to come to the United States from Guatemala, you hire a coyote, which is a coyote in English, coyote, and that's an indigenous canine to the New World. And a coyote is a sort of symbol of something that has no boundaries. It can travel freely, roams, if you will. And the coyote is a person who you pay to take you into the United States. And usually you pay about $5,000, but you don't pay cash. What do you think people pay? What do you think is the typical thing that people give as collateral to coyotes when they want to come to the United States? Certainly something to think about, right? What kind of, if people don't give cash, what do you think is their main sort of thing of value that they might have to give to the coyote, to basically the equivalent of 5,000, probably today it's up to $10,000, and you get three chances to come to the United States. I don't know if maybe that depends on the coyote, but you basically that's the sort of that's uh, the known sort of rules. You pay X amount of money and you get three chances, which means if the migration, if the United States catches you and sends you back, you still get two more chances to come. Well, the thing that people usually give up as collateral is the deed to their property. So most people have some kind of grandmother, grandparent, father, mother, sister, brother, cousin who has property, and they will offer that up as collateral, as payment for coming to the United States. And usually you have to pay that, usually it costs more. And so you have to basically become an indentured servant. You have to pay back the coyote. And often the cartels are involved. and often shady people are involved, and a lot of horrible things happen to people during the trip. It's very dangerous. And so maybe not the same kind of danger, but similar danger to what you see here. But even, I mean, I think I would probably prefer still risking walking over land and all these other things we just talked about versus getting into a boat and throwing yourself into the ocean like this. So, these people were probably all rescued, but this was a big deal back in the 90s, even probably deciding the election with Bush versus Gore when this kid, Elian Gonzalez, was rescued at sea and eventually taken back to Cuba. And a lot of people think that whole situation, fiasco with Cuba, led to George Bush getting elected and winning the state of Florida. Now, very important for you guys to understand that Florida is no longer a swing state the way it was, which means it used to either go Democrat or Republican, which means Florida was a very important political a place where a lot of both parties took a lot of interest because they could flip it one way or the other. That changed, I think, probably about a decade or so ago, and now Florida doesn't quite have the political relevance that it did before. And so just remember, at this time period, Florida was a very important swing state, and that's why Cuba remained a very important issue in Florida, because whatever was going on in Cuba could potentially flip Florida blue or red, Democrat or Republican. Now, because Fidel Castro's dead, because Cuba's kind of in another era, a lot of the Cuban community in the United States has grown so old that they've kind of aren't as upset or as politically relevant as they used to be in terms of standing up and opposing Cuba. And also, Florida is no longer an important swing state. So, in a lot of ways, Cuba's relevance politically in the United States depended on Florida being a swing state. And that has changed quite a bit. So, we're kind of looking at an era that's to a degree over, but I think threatens to rear its head again because of the economic situation in Cuba. So, you often hear about people fleeing Haiti or Cuba and people fleeing Central America because of, all kinds of reasons, political factors. I mean, if I remember correctly, I think while I was in Guatemala serving in the Peace Corps, I think the United States toppled one of the leaders of El Salvador, democratically elected a leader in favor of one of our puppets who we wanted in power. And that's led to a political crisis in El Salvador, which is why a lot of people from El Salvador have fled the country seeking asylum in the United States. I think similar situation in Venezuela. And so, I think the United States rightly welcomed people who are seeking asylum, especially because we caused the situation that they're seeking asylum from. Maybe it's different in another country where perhaps where we're not to blame for the political situation, but either way, you can understand that a lot of people come to the United States seeking a better life, but the other side of that is the United States wants to take advantage of cheap labor and not give those workers health care, not give them, all the kinds of things that your typical, quote, American citizen might expect. So, there's definitely two sides of immigration. There's exploitation of labor, and then there's people dealing with, political oppression that lead to them escaping and or economic despair. And so the boat becomes a symbol of escape and or migration and or danger. I think they pretty much speak for themselves. So this is Tania Bruguera, and she is someone who I think is kind of, I think, a fitting successor to Ana Mendieta in some ways. She's someone who has reperformed some of Ana Mendieta's work, and we will see another artist named Amabel Poblet, one of the millennials we'll look at, who I think studied under Tania Bruguera. So there is a connection from Ana Mendieta to Bruguera to Mabel Poblet in terms of performance art, but also other kinds of art. And this quote here, as you can see, says, respond to a low point when 36,000 Cubans attempted to cross the Straits of Florida. Um, and you could just imagine, what happened to them, how many, I don't know how many arrived, but I'm sure it wasn't all 36,000. And, you really, it's almost like the Straits of Florida becomes a graveyard. And Sandra Ramos addresses some of the stuff by, I think, looking back at her childhood growing up in Cuba, and I think using these everyday objects that have all this cultural significance. So, la maldita circunstancia del agua por todas partes, the kind of damn circumstances or the bad like damn bad circumstances of water for on all around everywhere. So, I think that's kind of commenting on the stuff we've been talking about. Water is a symbol of freedom, but also a symbol of danger and also a symbol of political isolation. It's very powerful. I think it's really, it's so bittersweet because the art is so powerful, and yet it's powerful because it's rooted in this crisis and, a sense of real pain and loss and suffering. And it's also a real, sad kind of chapter in the revolution, seremos como el Che. So that's we will be like Che Guevara. And I think this is going back to her childhood, the indoctrination, showing allegiance to Che Guevara, feeling a sense of national duty, patriotism. She's dressed up in the uniform of a child in Cuba, and really kind of using that uniform, that propaganda, that childhood education, and kind of reflecting on how it seems almost irrelevant or obsolete. Um, I think the idea of seremos como el Che is meant to be ironic, if not sort of kind of contradictory, because how will we be like Che um, if the revolution's over? Or maybe the idea here is we'll be like Che is, well, remember Che Guevara also left Cuba. Remember, he wrote a letter to Fidel and said, I'm better off fighting the revolution abroad. And you could say, in a way, ironically, Cubans leave Cuba. They're just doing what Che Guevara did. They left the country. Of course, having the star in her head, I think, is a very powerful connection to the politics. And I think the real question underlying this is where is the line between my obligation to myself, my obligation to Che Guevara, aka my obligation to my country. And I think you really can't expect people, when does nationalism stop and your own obligation to your family begin? And so that, again, we're within the revolution, everything against it or outside of it, nothing. I think, your obligation to your family or the revolution's obligation to family, you still have to feed yourself, your kids, your pets, right? Take care of your grandparents. And so there's a real kind of I think cognitive dissonance perhaps between your revolutionary upbringing and then your realization that the revolution, which was supposed to provide everything for you and give you a sense of certainty and as your compass, your true north, is now kind of the compass is spinning, right? Now the compass is like sinking underwater, and so I think carrying my cross around, same idea. What's your own obligation to sacrifice? Maybe wearing a mask during the pandemic, right? But then, well, what about, well, now you can't go out and socialize with everyone. And now the basketball hoops have no nets. And now you have to take the vaccine. And so there's a certain line where everyone's like, okay, I'll do this, I'll do this, I'll do this. Well, when will you say no? A kind of thing. And I think, Brave New World, 1984, the idea of 2 + 2 = 3 was example of reaching a point where people no longer where they surrender their own autonomy because they're just become so enslaved to some sort of external source of control and kind of steadfastness. So I think that is kind of the inner dialogue that she's externalizing here, that kind of what's my obligation to sacrifice for the revolution and what's my obligation to myself. And I think she's kind of pulling maybe the country out of her stomach there. And if there's any doubt, I think this piece really powerfully captures what I'm talking about. In any country, but particularly in Cuba, this suitcase is seen as the suitcase you bring on a one-way trip. It doesn't have wheels. It's a one. I think maybe the equivalent would be the suitcase a woman or a man has when they're leaving their partner, like when they're breaking up with their marriage, ending their marriage and running away or just going away permanently. So this suitcase symbolizes a one-way trip. So she's using that one-way trip suitcase as a symbol for Cubans deciding to take that one-way journey. You can see the plane there, of course. Um, and here, I think people floating in the water and the mines you can see, and there's the United States far off. So I think it's pretty self-explanatory. But the power of this is using the suitcase to really conceptually anchor the piece. So, it's powerful, but also maybe a sign that there's not a lot of paper, not a lot of other artistic materials. So you're going to use everyday objects and reinvent them and rely on that cultural baggage to make sense to make a clear work of art, but also because it's maybe safe. It's almost like a shield that you can hide behind because you're using the cultural baggage and leaning on that rather than necessarily challenging the government with imagery that might be um, too conventional because it's on a canvas, right? So putting this on a canvas might be more politically hostile than putting it in a suitcase, right? And I think that's so fascinating for me that the canvas is a kind of the state has a monopoly on the canvas, right? The same way a television screen, has a certain power versus, making something on a piece of paper, right? Or a billboard has a certain authority versus, a mural on the side of a house, kind of thing. So, I think these are all strategies by artists to either cope with the lack of resources or to just, be resourceful with whatever materials are available. And maybe the idea here is you can always close the suitcase and hide the message away from the government if as needed. I don't think that's the point here, but I think you have to kind of certainly consider the idea that this work of art can be closed from view. And there's a nice metaphor for that between your journey was probably done without official sanctioning, and likewise the art you make about that journey is also something you want to be able to close and hide away from scrutiny. And this too, if you take my Mexican muralism class, it's really hard not to think that that not Tanya, but Sandra Ramos is relating this to Frida Kahlo, who famously came to the United States and she made a painting that says, "My dress still hangs there," because her dress became a symbol for her sort of fluctuating identity. In this case, this is Sandra Ramos's uniform from being a child growing up in Cuba, revolutionary Cuba. And I think it's the same idea, how the dress becomes a symbol of that outward externalization of politics and, your autonomy and being able to remove that clothing metaphorically and, literally. And, that dress hanging without the body in it is like a sense that you've lost something fundamental to yourself. You're in a state of flux. You've gone back to a state of vulnerability. Um, and now it looks like we're kind of in a suitcase, but now she's kind of playing with the suitcase and reinventing it. And yes, she will, like others, leave Cuba and take that one-way trip to the United States. But notice she does so many years later than what we've seen. So she does stay in Cuba much longer than a lot of the artists from the 80s and 90s. So if you do want to write about Sandra Ramos, you might consider the circumstances that led to her to ultimately leave Cuba once and for all. And let me see how far we are. So let's take a break right here. I think this is we're going to see some more artists, and hopefully we'll get into the next lecture. But if not, that's fine. We can pay our dues to this era. And yeah, I'll see you guys back in about 5 or 10 minutes. All right, let's resume where we left off. Yeah, and here you can see many artists. I mean, just look at how many artists are making the ocean and the water um, a a central subject to their artwork. We see in migrants, boats, crossing the water, people flying, the flamingo flying bird, the idea of flying across the water, taking a boat. So when it comes to this matter, within the revolution, outside the revolution, we're kind of you can see that in a way there's nothing there's no focus on anything political here. In a way that literally Florida, the Straits of Florida bring you outside the revolution. There's no better or clearer example of being outside the revolution than going across the Straits of Florida and leaving Cuba, literally physically bringing yourself outside the revolution. So in a way, these artists have clearly reached a point where there's something has changed. There's some point of no return artistically or culturally has happened where artists are no longer feel necessarily the sort of obligation to make works of art that are within the revolution because there's kind of this uh, specter of danger and or this cultural thing happening that it's clearly just a part of this collective experience. And I don't think the governments will go about trying to censor artists who are addressing this question of the ocean because you can almost feel like it's just too deep, too beyond the scope of the government's scrutiny and or the government itself. Is filled with people who are concerning the same question: should I stay or should I go? And I think that really goes to show that, there is a point where the government loses its relevance if it tries to get too kind of micromanagerial about this kind of stuff, because it's gone beyond the point where that would even be effective and or meaningful, because this is speaking to something way beyond the sort of political obligations and or beyond the sort of one dimensionality of the politics. This is a deep, multi-gradient sort of question, like, who am I? What's my future? What's my obligations to my family? How do I honor the people who have died? Once it comes to kind of the collective experience of suffering and tragedy, people dying, you're gonna really probably risk a lot of political capital by, throwing people in jail for making works of art that at the very least kind of honor the memory of the dead who've left the country. It'd be really tacky if the government says, how dare you reflect on the death of people who died in the ocean. That's how dare you. I think, there's a point where the government will lose a lot of, whatever reverence people might have for it left, because you're just sort of becoming, equivalent of being, a bully, or, cultural bully, or culturally so insecure about things that, you just kind of are clear, you betray the fact that you are so alienated from the people you're supposed to serve. So, this is really an age where the art world is reacting to forces that are beyond the power in a way of the government. And I think it's such a widespread shift at such a deep level that it's kind of just recalibrated everything politically. And I think it really is also, you have to think about, if there was any effort by the government to rein in some of this artwork, and rein in some of this sort of cultural fragmentation, outside the revolutionness, well, that will be counterbalanced by this realization that the artists are the best ambassadors to the revolution. So there's a kind of contradiction here, where on one hand, artists are kind of asserting their being outside the revolution, considering things that are literally, going to Florida, leaving Cuba is literally removing yourself from the revolution. But at the same time, artists who stay in Cuba, who don't quote unquote make the mistake of the previous generation, might benefit from staying in Cuba, because they can travel to and from other countries and bring back art materials and or sell their artwork to the art world in Miami and elsewhere, and benefit from being Cuban artists who have this sort of unique view from within that kind of aquarium of communism in Cuba, especially as it sort of spirals into wherever the next chapter will be. And on that note, you might also think of, well, so these artists who benefit from staying in Cuba, and they become sort of an elite class in Cuba that can do things that others, a privileged class, right? Will that change as the revolution shrinks, or the revolution loses some of its grip? Does that mean the arts will no longer be a sort of precious commodity to the art world around the world? And I think that's certainly something we'll have to you'll hear about. And maybe the Cuban artists will reach a certain kind of place of, or maybe the art world will lose interest in Cuba. I doubt it, but that's something to consider as we move forward. What is what has the institution of art in Cuba reached a point where it's kind of irrelevant, but rather, and that's why artists shift to the streets, why street artists might be more relevant today in Cuba than artists trained by the revolution, trained in the academies. Maybe a Cuban artist working in the street has more relevance because they're reaching out with social media and bypassing the government. And you might think about a parallel between that and Banksy. I think you could say the same thing about Banksy, that he is someone who represents the both a new phase of art, but also betrays the irrelevance of the art world, because which has become so elitist. The Sotheby's and Art Basel and money laundering from the drug world and just the overall vanity of the art world, if not the commodification of the art world, the celebrity focus of the art world, the glamour, the sort of Andy Warhol idea of the art world being a place of glamour and fashion and beautiful young people. And then, of course, the underside of that is, exploiting people. I think there's a certain kind of, I don't want to say Jeffrey Epstein quality to the art world, but I'm sure you can. I'm sure in our lifetime we'll hear more about the kind of seedy character of the art world, and I think we saw some of that with Ana Mendieta. And I think there's probably a lot of really sketchy, shady stuff that happens in any world where it's dominated by money, celebrity, vanity, narcissism. And if you go to the art world in the United States, some of it often you see in the contemporary art world a lot of sexuality, a lot of nostalgia, a lot of innocence, and it's almost like we're kind of searching for meaningfulness in the face of kind of vanity or narcissism or celebrity, or we make the subject of our art the commodification of culture or the celebrity quality of culture. And Cuba is such a nice palate cleanser for that, because Cuban art is still kind of in this realm of skill and kind of relevance and collective, and just some there's just a degrees of difference between Cuban art and what I might think of as like quote unquote US art world. And so maybe that's part of the value that the art world sees, that Cuban artists still believe, they have a sense of a belief in the value of art that's more as far as it changing the world rather than just sort of advancing your celebrity status or making you more collectible, right? I think today, if I think of Mexican muralism, I think, okay, here's an art form that's really all about um, making the world better, improving the average person's life. The art is totally meant to be accessible and populist in its appeal. And I would say the art world in the United States is not at all about kind of reaching out to people, and not obviously exceptions, but I think we have a more kind of commodified art world and more capitalistic art world, and that can have good sides and bad sides. But I think that's why there's a lot of interest in Cuban art, because it's somehow kind of trailblazes its own journey, and people I think want to know where it's going to go, and they not note its uniqueness as far as what's going on as a contrast to what's going on in the rest of the world. Alicia Leal is a great example, and I think this painting really speaks to a lot of the things we're talking about today with this Christian framework here with Adam and Eve. And you might think of Cuba as a paradise equivalent of the Garden of Eden. And this wonderfully clever idea of thinking about the idea of leaving Eden to go into the world. Of course, the story is Adam and Eve were supposed to not eat the apple of the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, and they end up betraying God's one rule, and they suffer the consequences, and being forcibly exiled out of paradise. An obvious kind of connection to Cuba here, and you might have to consider, well, how far does the metaphor continue? Is it totally mirror? Are they totally the same, or where do they deviate? And of course, one is a biblical story, the other is more about Cuba, perhaps having some similarity to that. But of course, the devil's in the detail, and the differences, of course, are it's not about necessarily betraying God so much as betraying Fidel Castro, right? And the forces leading you out of your country might not necessarily be you betraying your country, but rather you reaching a point where you can't feed yourself, and the only thing left in Eden to eat is that one apple, and the government's saying, "Don't eat that apple." And can you blame anyone for kind of eating something when they're starving? So you might consider writing about this painting, because it's also covering they're obviously in the perhaps in the United States on the other side here on the right side, but now they're wearing a mask, and or now they're totally naked and vulnerable. So there's a wonderfully um, insightful overlay of the two sort of stories, the Garden of Eden, the expulsion, as it were, and the idea of leaving Cuba behind, another kind of expulsion. And I think her, pictures speak to the same idea. Water is a place of transformation, being caught in a net, that watery barrier. This is kind of an echo of some of the other paintings we've seen. Likewise here. And I'm not going to spend too much time on these. Just can notice the dates. We're still talking about, not now we're not in the 90s here. We are in the early 2000s, still addressing this question of water and, crossing the water as a sanctuary or a place of danger. And maybe on top of water, we got wings and flying. And this is interesting as I read this is we were surrounded by an aggressive context, too acidic to survive it. And that's, of course, the political context. And one of the solutions that we found in order to survive those hard times of hunger, of real physical hunger, was our group. We opted to concentrate on the workshop, technique, painting. It provided the perfect pretense to concentrate on specific things and forget the context. Our work also had a redemptive quality. In order to survive, we focused on friendship and what we could offer each other. So almost like a proclamation of being outside the revolution, a way they're kind of no longer feel obligation to the revolution so much as their own sense of meaning, personal meaning, and connectedness to other people. And I think that's really powerful. And Aglutinador is a really wonderful example of a gallery opened by Sandra Ceballos, where I'll play the clip, but I don't think I have time, where she just talks about how her gallery became a kind of sanctuary for artists during this time. And, the government, in addition to this gallery, the government will also open a whole bunch of galleries and quote unquote non-governmental organizations as a way to attract tourism and that very highly coveted art collector money, because there's a lot of money in art. And so the government wisely invests in opening galleries and will be very much more supportive of artists starting around the mid 1990s, because it understands that art collection, art collectors, the art world is a major part of tourism, and very valuable to Cuba as a way to attract tourists to Cuba. And so it will elevate Cuban artists and allow Cuban artists to take more liberty than they ever could have in the 1990s, or the 1980s and the early 90s. So that's, perhaps a positive. And so we see towards the kind of end of this era a lot of reflection and reflecting in a way that you might not have ever seen in previous eras. So Fidel is also, of course, Fidel Castro, but it also means loyalty. And, putting that in the shape of a flag and doing so in blood, almost like an Ana Mendieta quote, is a really powerful statement. The idea of, what's my loyalty to my country and to Fidel, and playing around with the word Fidel. And likewise here, in the 1980s, you never would have been allowed to portray Fidel Castro eating. In fact, you were forbidden from showing him eating or standing next to anyone taller than him. And so just the idea that Twyrak, who's, painting this, I think in 2019, 3 years after Fidel Castro's death, this is him obviously saying, look, I can do this now. I can show Fidel this way because he no longer has the reverence that we used to have for him, and or it's just, he's now in the past, and now we're focusing on the future, and I'm going to do things I could never get away with. And of course, adding the Coca-Cola in the background is another element, I think, of parody here. And yeah, I think Twyrak is, knocking Fidel Castro down a few pegs and considering his relevance, moving forward. And I think using, the advertising and juxtaposing the two, kind of commodifying the revolution. And likewise, doing so with Che Guevara, whose body was returned to Cuba, I think in 1990s. The bones, the remains of Fidel Castro, of Che Guevara, which were in Bolivia, were brought back to Cuba. And so in a way, it's a time to reflect on the legacy of Che Guevara, and of course on the legacy of Fidel Castro as he reaches the sort of twilight of his political career. So here you can see at stake was a deliberate process of knocking all of those revolutionary icons um, off their high horse in order to literally make them walk our streets, to place them in confrontation with the same falsehoods that ordinary Cubans face. So this is a very powerful quote from an artist, basically saying that these political leaders are out of touch with the reality that the average Cuban faces. And that's really powerful. But I also want you to think about, well, what about also the artists might reach a point where they too become somewhat out of touch with the average Cuban. If they can travel freely and benefit from leaving the country, they become almost like a privileged class as well. And I think that's will be the subject of our class next week when we look at the Cuban millennials, because a lot of wonderful Cuban artists who are, about your age, a little older, maybe between my age and your age, who are kind of have become a privileged class of artists who can have their art on exhibit all around the world. Um, but whether or not their art speaks to the concerns of the average Cuban is certainly something we'll consider next week. So I think the idea here is, I think a lot of what you see here, not only just addressing water, but also, like the artist said, knocking Fidel, off his high horse and questioning the reverence for the revolution. And I think that's why this piece is so powerful. Here's a microphone facing the other way. That's cool. And this is by the artist we just saw, Rene Francisco, and these 100 iron cask microphones on the Malecon wall. So now you can kind of understand the Malecon, this seawall on Havana, as a very important metaphorical connection to the outside world, but also a barrier, right? And speaking into this barrier through speaking out into this microphone becomes, I think, a way to speak to the dead, and also maybe to express your own thoughts on the inside about wanting to leave the country, and a chance for you to reflect on what keeps you. The wall here keeps you, but also what else is preventing you from climbing up on that wall. And maybe the microphones being a little too high up, being slightly out of reach, is part of the point, and or being so big that they're really meant for someone with the large, stature and size of Fidel Castro. I mean, metaphorically and otherwise. Um, and I think that could be part of the sort of power here. But of course, it's also a very clever way of perhaps addressing the political situation, but doing so in a kind of metaphorical way, using a culturally loaded symbol that isn't necessarily as perhaps confrontational when it comes to addressing the Cubans, and like what Antonio Ides kind of making a subject out of the Cuban people. Well, here it's this is really about giving the average Cuban an outlet for expressing themselves. And that's a very different strategy than, making a painting showing a podium, addressing the audience like we see here. They're almost like night and day, two strategies, both very powerful. But I think you can understand why this might upset the government, giving maybe you're at the podium and you're speaking to a kind of blurry, blobby mob of people, versus this, where it's really about you individually having an outlet for your self-expression. But I think it's a really fitting, perhaps, homage to Antonia Itis to use this podium and the microphone as a symbol that's very powerful in Cuba, because it means access to communication, perhaps freedom to speak. And the fact that you're on this side with this VIP exclusive means everyone else is on the other side, right? So this is very powerful, I think, partly because it's the reason why maybe this was so easily subject to criticism is because you're kind of saying, look, the elite have power and access and privilege, everyone else doesn't. And I think ultimately that's why the painting was so upsetting to the powerful Cuban political elite, is because this is really calling out the reality in Cuba, which is you're on the other side, and if you're in the party and you're elite, you have all the privileges and power and the VIP access to this tool of expression, right? And here, I think the artists are kind of saying we're reclaiming this tool, even if we're not really connected, we're at least metaphorically reclaiming that power for everyone. And you all have this, even if it's just the equivalent of like speaking into a Fisher-Price toy microphone. At the very least, you're kind of reclaiming, appropriating that cultural icon and kind of challenging that exclusivity, that privileged idea, hovering and or forming a halo around the microphone. So I think this is a good place to end. And I think what we will move, what we see next class is this wave of Cuban millennials who will grow up in this time of crisis in the 1990s, and will, I think, ultimately choose to stay in Cuba. They won't leave Cuba because they understand that that is a one-way street if you leave Cuba. So the next wave of Cuban artists who we look at, the Cuban millennials, as I call them, will be the artists who offer a kind of more international kind of focus. They will kind of shift away from uh, focusing on the ocean and the water, and kind of in a way kind of become more relevant to the greater art world at large, kind of be more, I think, in conversation with things taking place outside of Cuba. But then the question, of course, becomes, is their art still speaking to Cuban concerns? And especially as the Bolsero crisis shifts to kind of tourism and shifts to questioning like the future of the revolution as Fidel Castro gets old. Now, politically, Venezuela will prop up Cuba, or economically, Venezuela and Hugo Chavez will prop up Cuba for about a decade or so. But Hugo Chavez will die, I think, in 2014. So, that's just a temporary respite from this sort of hurricanes of change that are, I think, even now, it's like a slow moving hurricane that's just transforming Cuba. And, it lacks any interest from the United States the way we were very interested in Cuba when Florida was a swing state, when Fidel was still alive, and when the Cuban exiles were still young enough to really feel like they had some sense of duty to make up for the um, the law, the fact that they got their property seized by the Cuban Revolution. A lot of those Cubans who left Cuba after the revolution are now in their 80s, if not older, and so that's why a lot of the world has changed, Cuba has changed, and a lot of political sort of variables have changed. But the people suffering through all this are the Cuban people who really don't have the kind of ability to, unless they kind of rise up and takes to the streets, which might, of course, happen. I think maybe the artists are the best source of some kind of relief and or sense of meaningfulness or purpose in the face of these the political uncertainty facing Cuba. So next class we'll focus on Cuban millennials who will be artists trained by the revolution, traveling abroad, making art that I think is much more about kind of focusing on international subject matter, although not completely. And then we'll be looking at street artists who take their art to the street. I think offer a kind of Banksy-like challenge to the institutions. Any questions from anyone about what we talked about today? I think it was good to focus on the Balsero crisis on its own. Just remember, we've got, I think, two more classes at least. I'll update you on that. And so you want to think about an artist to write about for your paper, and certainly many of the ones we looked at today are good to write about. And I'll stick around for a moment if you have any questions. And yeah, anything, the artwork, we just talked the artwork. I was wondering if I missed anything. I'm just responding to a question from Josh that might be relevant to everyone else. No, the main thing right now is just focus on an artist to write about for your paper, and I'll give you guys some more guidance about that in the coming days. Just focus on maybe an artist you like, who's someone who you might want to research. And I think with any Cuban artist you write about, I think the focus should be on finding out about their personal history and just think about how their personal history one, that how that makes their artwork meaningful, but then of course fit that into the politics of within the revolution, against the revolution, and how their art might relate to that, whether or not they're retreating into some space beyond the revolution, or if they're using a different strategy, metaphor, whatnot. And as far as pages, I'd say 2 to 3 pages max. And if you do use ChatGPT, which I think is a great resource, it's like a writing tutor, just make sure you guys do the changes. So the big thing is let chat if you filter your writing through chat GPT or any kind of AI, just make sure you don't let the AI make the changes for you. As long as you make the changes, then you'll learn, how to write better. But if it does it for you, then you're never going to learn how to write better, and that will really hurt you down the road when it comes to feeling like you can do things like write on your own without needing the computer, which is a good tutor, but not a substitute for your own writing. So just that's one little bit of guidance for as far as like, imagine it's equivalent of AI, having AI make your art for you. You just don't learn anything if you don't, apply the paint or, shift the pixels around. So hopefully you like what we looked at today. It's a little depressing, but also I think a very powerful moment in Cuban history that will continue to kind of echo into the future and might even be a kind of something that Cuba revisits because a lot of people are leaving Cuba. Now, fortunately, they're not leaving necessarily in makeshift boats, but traveling in planes and leaving the country. And you might ask, if you know any Cubans who are living in Florida, ask them, how did you come to the United States? What are the circumstances? And that will, I think, give you a great insight into the realities facing Cubans today. And again, think about an artist you might want to write about. But if you didn't see anyone who you like today, that's fine. You'll see some more artists next class and the following one, and I'll give you some guidance as I think about what I want you guys to do a little more clearly in my head. So I hope you guys have a great day and your semesters are going well. And I'll see you guys next Thursday? I'll stick around if anyone has any more questions.